In the late 90s, however, Fang was brought out of his solitude when he was recruited by the Shadow Government. This organisation was started sometime after World War II. It was a somewhat futile attempt to keep the supernatural at bay. Unlike Scathach or Rentros, the Shadows did not set out to destroy the supernatural. On the contrary, they made deals with local demon and vampire kings, and even offered up sacrifices to certain demons and creatures. The Shadow Government believed that it was futile to attempt to destroy the supernatural, as it would always exist on the earth in some form or another, and so the only way to keep most of humanity safe was to try and find a way to keep the paranormal in order. They still used all of their resources against creatures that threatened the world, or to expose the supernatural, but again, unlike Rentros or Scathach, they believed that they would never get distracted by low-level street demons. They had an uneasy relationship with Rentros, with both acknowledging the need for the other, but sometimes clashing. Fang was somewhat reluctant to join at first, and eventually agreed only in the hopes that he could infiltrate and destroy some of the most prominent demons from within, as well as use their resources to further his time travel experiments. Needless to say, Fang's time with the Shadow Government did not go smoothly, but in time he became more callous and turned a blind eye to many of their more corrupt dealings. It would be wrong to say he did no good with them. Despite their ruthlessness, their much greater resources and access to dark magics did allow them to stop threats to the world that neither Rentros or Scathach could have. Nevertheless, Fang would regard the over 10 years he was with them as being the low point of his life after his time with the dragons. A combination of his obsession with discovering time travel and perhaps the loss of Chat had hardened him somewhat. His time with them came to an end when he was approached by a witch whose coven had been slaughtered by the Shadow Government using a device Fang had constructed to stop an earlier demon invasion. Whilst Fang had made sure to conceal the weapon's plans from them, the Shadow Government was still able to keep tabs on Fang and eventually replicate the weapon. This wasn't the first time they had used it, and, overcome with guilt, Fang not only helped the witch avenge her coven and kill all who had used the weapon, as well as destroy all copies of it, he delivered a devastating blow to the Shadow Government. Fang and the witch, whose name was Salisa, were forced to go on the run for years, with there even being rumours that they became lovers. Salisa was several hundred years old as well, having also discovered immortality later in life like Fang. However, this is not known for sure, and most doubt it, given Fang's nature. At some point in the early 21st century, Salisa died whilst helping to repel an invasion of the Kailskin, and Fang was left so broken by her death, he let his guard down and was subsequently captured and imprisoned by the Shadow Government. Regardless of whether he was in love with her or not, Fang always regarded Salisa as one of the most important people in his centuries-long life, as she pulled him free from the Shadow Government's grasp. Fang was kept locked up in a state of suspended animation for over 100 years, with the Shadow Government not wanting to kill him due to his intellect, which they hoped they could harness. Fang, however, had placed numerous spells around his mind, gathered over several planets and eras, to prevent telepaths from ever reading his mind. In time, as they had bigger fish to fry, Fang was simply forgotten about by the Shadow Government and left to rot in their vaults. The vampire only emerged again after the supernatural was finally exposed to the world in the late 22nd century, which led to the collapse of civilization. The Shadow Government was among the first institutions to fall, ironically after the supernatural was exposed. It literally tore itself apart, with several of its members forgetting their alliance with humanity and other races once the truth was exposed. The headquarters of the Shadow Government, which were located beneath the Bermuda Triangle, was subsequently abandoned for decades after the fall of human society, with Fang still being kept in suspended animation below, along with many of the former government's other enemies. At some point in the 23rd century, however, Fang was inadvertently freed by a mutated creature. This entity was the spawn of Dalsrex, who was neither demon, nor monster, nor beast, and was the original inhabitant of the Bermuda Triangle and responsible for the many strange disappearances that had happened there. He came from the dark place at the bottom of the ocean. Life forms from this area are very rarely sighted on the surface. Only 3 have ever been recorded in any great detail, with the famous bloop from Point Nemo being another. Dalsrex famously captured any people that passed by its lair in the triangle using teleportation abilities that are still not completely understood in order to use them as hosts for its eggs. This was obviously not a natural reproduction process for this creature, or if it was, then humans were simply not fit to be its host. Indeed, no surface creature was strong enough to host larvae. A few of its vile children lived for short periods, but it was often as hideously deformed mutations that either died after a few months or were killed by Dalsrex itself in disgust. Dalsrex did later, however, find a way for some of his test subjects to live a lot longer, for possibly up to several years. Despite his disgust at them, these lesser children would serve as useful foot soldiers for Dalsrex, and be sent to capture people from all over the world to use as part of his experiments. Not surprisingly, fewer people became willing to travel over the triangle after the disappearances. The founders of the shadow government were able, pulling all of their resources together, to trap Dalsrex in a magical bubble in the 1980s, which held the monster for over 200 years. They built their new headquarters over its nest as a sign of their triumph. The creature that freed Fang, meanwhile, was the only survivor of Dalsrex's children. This poor unfortunate soul only survived due to the shadow government, who captured it after defeating Dalsrex. They subsequently used their magics to attempt to cure the beast, not out of altruism, but just because they were terrified of what Dalsrex could do if he ever escaped. Their experiments did, at the very least, prolong the creature's life, but ultimately, when all attempts failed, they used the creature as an agent, until it eventually broke free and went on the run. After civilization fell, the child of Dalsrex, who, as a man, had gone by the name of Paul, eventually returned to the Bermuda Triangle, hoping it could use the power of the former shadow government prison to control Dalsrex and use him to bring order to the world. It was a perilous journey for Paul, during which the entire crew who accompanied him were killed. The oceans had become just as difficult to cross as the land, as now the numerous marine supernatural creatures, such as dragons and sirens and charodons, no longer had to keep hidden. Sadly, Paul's own inexperience and tampering with the shadow government's magics released all of their prisoners, including Fang. Dalsrex, meanwhile, after seeing that there were no more people in the area thanks to the collapse of society, fled across the world to find more humans he could use in his experiments. Fang was soon aided by Paul, who helped him drive the other prisoners out of the area, and, using the government's weapons, Fang made his former captor's old headquarters his new base of operations. From his former prison, Fang worked on a way to help cure Paul and continued to tinker away with his time travel experiments, all the while also aiding the scattered groups of humans all over the world unite and fight back against the supernatural. In time, he put together an organization made up of hunters and warriors all over the world that he named after him. They tended to work more in secret, but they still established cells in every continent and played a key role in repelling the supernatural menace around the world. Eventually, with the aid of Fang and technology and magic from the old shadow government, the professor was finally able to contact the Venusians, who he knew about from his previous journeys through space. With the Venetians and the soldiers of the Nexus's aid, the soldiers were establishing themselves at this point, the Professor and his team were able to re-establish civilization on Earth in the 23rd century, which led to mankind's golden age, which is still ongoing, as of the writing of this article, in the 25th century. Sadly, however, it will come to an end many hundreds of years from now, in the 28th century, when mankind is visited by a terror from beyond the stars, a race of vicious, octopoid creatures known as the Hylexans. It is said that the Hylexans have mastered magic to a greater extent than almost any other race in the universe, and have conquered hundreds of planets. Their policy is to subjugate a species and break them until they are incapable or unwilling to fight back. But if said race continues to show resistance, then the Hylexans will cut their losses and exterminate them completely. Professor Fang kept a low profile during the Golden Age of mankind, with his organization officially disbanding after the war. Indeed, I'd wager most of you reading right now will have never heard of him. This was deliberate on his part, as he wanted to continue to work on his time travel experiments, and certainly didn't want their knowledge getting out. Fang will once again be forced to put his time travel experiments on hold during the Hylexan War, where he will fight valiantly against these monsters. Sadly, however, in the end, the Hylexans will not only triumph, they will completely destroy the surface of the earth. It will not be entirely with their own weapons, as many other sources, including some of the earliest documents we received from the time travellers, claim, however. Rather, the Hylexans will discover the hand of Ares, the war god's ultimate weapon, that was banished into space centuries ago, and catapult it towards the Earth using one of their missiles. It will finally accomplish what Ares had intended to do all those centuries ago, and destroy all life on the planet Earth, except for those on the small island of Point Nemo. This island is the most remote place on Earth. It is so far from any other landmass that the nearest humans to it in the 25th century are in space. Ironically, it was created by Ares himself during the days of his war with the other gods. He gathered the most terrible demons, monsters, and beasts here, both to experiment on and test to see which creatures would be the best soldiers in his army. Ultimately, however, Ares was forced to abandon his island when he suffered greater losses on the mainland than he had predicted. This, ironically, led to the war god creating the hand in the first place, whilst his island was simply abandoned even before he later fled the Earth. Point Nemo remained largely isolated and forgotten due to its remote location, and a force field placed around it by Ares himself, whilst the creatures he had gathered continued to fight with each other for dominance. Though there were other visitations to it in the 20th and 21st centuries, these all remained secret. At some point, an elite group of wizards, witches, and warlocks were told by an iteration of the time-travelling Circus family to not only hide out on Point Nemo, but to work on a spell that would protect the island and restore the Earth after the Hylexans were destined to strip it of all life. It is believed that this elite coven first retreated to Point Nemo in the middle of the 21st century. Of course, if they could, the Circus family would have given them knowledge on how to prevent the Hylexan attack. But as we have been over, it is not possible to change established history to that extent. The wizards and witches of Point Nemo will capture Fang in the last year of the Hylexan War, where his knowledge will be put to use in strengthening the force field from the hand of Ares. Sadly, however, even with their centuries of working on the force field and Fang's help, it does not offer complete protection from the hand. The force field is not only damaged, but the wizards and witches' city on the island built up over centuries, is devastated, resulting in the monsters of Point Nemo being able to overrun it and much of the work being lost. It will take another 100 years for Fang and the other surviving wizards and witches to overcome the horrors of Point Nemo again, rediscover the lost work, and finally complete the spell. Once that is accomplished, the spell will be cast that will restore all life to our planet. Huge, beautiful forests will cover the lands once more, and oceans and rivers will return as golden waters. This reborn Earth will be christened Tyros. Unfortunately, an unintended side effect of this restorative spell will revive hundreds of life forms from multiple periods throughout our history. Humans, demons, dinosaurs will all once again stalk the land, and they will battle with the survivors of Point Nemo and their descendants for resources. Even worse than that, however, not every creature who is brought back will be as they once were. Twisted, grotesque caricatures of human beings and dinosaurs and even demons will stalk the lands, such as the horrifying Vasta. It's a disturbing thought that any of us or our loved ones could one day become one of those abominations. It actually did motivate me to move to a colony on Mars. Thankfully, my wife didn't mind one bit, as she had family there, but if I were being honest with her, it wasn't just to help her get in touch with her Martian roots. I can only pray that my children remain proud Martians and never get an interest in their human roots. Some of the revived humans and the descendants of the survivors of Point Nemo will gather together into scattered cities and communities all over the world, or Tyros, whilst Fang will come to settle in the city of Mostarik and continue his time travel experiments. He will finally, after centuries, master them and create his ultimate ship from a combination of both science and magic called the Bat. Fang will then simply leave Mostarik and Tyros behind, though Mostarik will continue with some of the time travel experiments left over by Fang. What will become of them is a story for another time. The Bat, meanwhile, was named after its design and shape. Again, one can't accuse Fang of not embracing the vampire motif, even if he fought his demonic nature. It was comparable in size to a small town, and was capable of travelling through time and space, and could also sense the exact points in time that Fang could visit without interference, and the periods he had to visit in order to ensure the timeline as he knew it came to pass. It also possessed teleportation capabilities, and could conceal itself using magic from being detected. The vampire subsequently spent hundreds of thousands of years exploring all of time and space in the Bat. We cannot even begin to comprehend the full extent of his impact on history, or, indeed, hope to come close to chronicling his complete adventures and life during this period. Only a few vital details are known. At some point in his travels, when he was alone, the professor met the first incarnation of the circus master, Ron Baker, who had crashed on an isolated planet after helping to steal the Vandals' time machine that the Soul Devourers had been working on during the centuries they ruled Europe from behind the scenes. Ron himself was a Vandal, albeit one who had reformed. Fang helped fix the time machine and refined it to be like his own, allowing Ron to travel through time and space in a similar fashion. Ron, under the identity of the circus master to match his colourful ship, would recruit many other strange creatures and heroes to be part of his circus family, whilst the title of the circus master was also later passed down to 6 other heroes after Ron's death. Ironically, it was a later iteration of the circus family who played an important role in Fang's own history through establishing the coven on Point Nemo. It was also during this period that the professor orchestrated the battle for all creation. Arguably, the most significant war in the history of our universe. It started when the survivors of the universe before ours tried to re-engineer our reality to suit them. Natural universes, such as ours, go through different stages of development, each of which last trillions of years. Different life forms emerge during each of these distinct periods, with most not being able to survive from one evolutionary stage of the universe to the next. However, there does come a point where the universe can no longer evolve and eventually collapses into dust, after which a new reality takes its place. And on this process will repeat forever within our multiverse, which is known as the natural realm. The life forms that invaded our reality, meanwhile, who we would come to know as the Gallowayans, were the most advanced creatures in their universe. They are believed to have come from the final period of their reality's history, though some have speculated that they may have come from an earlier point and simply found a way to survive their own universe's evolution. Given that they cheated the death of their universe itself, it is certainly possible. The Gallowayans hoped to simply create another universe to inhabit before theirs collapsed, but they found that this was impossible. The natural realm must be in perfect balance. There can only be a certain number of universes in it at a time, with each set of universes dying in sync with one another. If there is one universe too many, then the entire natural realm will begin to collapse under its own weight. Instead, the Gallowayans decided to inhabit the next universe after theirs, which they would alter to be like their universe, or rather their stage of it, to survive. Had they succeeded in accelerating its development, then life in the universe as we know it would never have evolved. Fang soon realized that the only reason his history existed was because he went back and stopped the Gallowayans. In order to do that, however, the professor was forced to gather soldiers from all over the history of the universe, and in some cases other realities, as an army to fight them. This proved to be such a burden that even Fang, with everything he had lived through and done, felt like giving up, as more and more young men and women were sent to their deaths. But ultimately he knew he couldn't give up, and it wasn't even just the fate of his universe. The Gallowayans, if not stopped, would go on to do the same to other realities after they had used up ours, with their constant tampering with the structure of other universes also causing anomalies and problems with the entire omniverse our multiverse exists within, hence why soldiers from other realities were only too eager to help Fang. Among those Fang recruited included the first iteration of the Circus family, before Carleen, another remorseful vampire, and their longest-serving member joined, and the enigmatic time traveller from another universe, Dr. Omega. The war waged on for thousands of years, but it eventually ended in a victory for Fang's side. However, not all the Gallowayans perished in the war, with several using stolen technology from Fang's side to flee into another universe, such as Dr. Omega's, or into later periods of our own where they would become major enemies of Fang's. The professor was broken by the war, and even took time out of his travels for many centuries. Using technology left over from the war, Fang planted life on a small, unimportant planet in a remote area of space. It became his own personal garden planet, and he used his ship to populate it with animals from all over time and space, always being sure to pluck an animal that was dying and wounded and abandoned that would have had no further importance in the timeline. Dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and marine reptiles became the dominant life forms on this garden world of Fang's, and he spent many years living there before finally returning to his travels. As much as he may have wanted to rest, the timeline still needed him. Nevertheless, every now and again, Fang continued to return to his garden planet for peace. From this period on, Fang took on many travelling companions, believing that after the war he worked better with help. His two most famous and long-lasting companions were Lindsay Kate Mackintosh and Kirstine Williamson. Lindsay had a long and successful career as a vampire hunter prior to working with Fang. She first learned about the paranormal during a stay in the Galloway region of Scotland in the early 2000s. She was almost killed by the followers of a legendary vampire king named the Blue Devil, who were attempting to resurrect him, only to be saved by agents of Scathach. Following this experience, Lindsay came to work for Scathach and was stationed in its Highlands department near Avermore. There, she worked with the other famous reformed vampire Carleen, Lamb, her Zeta Reticulan friend, and an elderly Daniel Wynne, battling all sorts of monsters, demons, and paranormal creatures. Following Carleen's disappearance, however, in 2007, the group started to break up, and Lindsay eventually struck out on her own. Though it was another 10 or so years before she encountered Fang, during that time she went through many great losses. She and Fang developed the closest relationship of any of his companions, apart from possibly Chat. Much like Chat in many ways, Lindsay was the daughter that Fang never had. Kirstine, meanwhile, was a famous rock star during the 1970s and the 1980s, whose career had sadly collapsed in the early 80s due to a combination of her personal problems and the unforgiving media. While she had overcome both her depression and alcoholism by the end of the decade, most of her so-called friends and fans had abandoned her. After her mysterious disappearance in the late 80s, she was, of course, celebrated, as all dead artists are. Whilst many assumed she had simply succumbed to her problems again, in truth she was abducted by a time-travelling, living magic ship that had abducted many life forms from all over time and space to be its crew, both for company and to fight evil throughout the universe. Sadly, this ship crashed into Fang's, and in the resulting crisis, he was able to save Kirstine, who was forced to join him afterwards. Unlike Lindsay, Kirstine was not happy at joining Fang at first. While she admittedly didn't have much to live for back home, she nevertheless was both horrified and terrified of the creatures she came across in her first few adventures. However, it was her friendship with Lindsay that ultimately convinced her to stay, and while she and Fang never quite enjoyed the same level of closeness as Fang and Lindsay, Kirstine nevertheless became one of the longest-serving companions. Due to being outside of the time vortex, Lindsay and Kirstine aged considerably slower than a normal person, with both staying with the vampire for centuries. Whilst the vampire had many companions, both before and after Lindsay and Kirstine, including the legendary vampire killer Ching Quan, the great explorer Vanessa Sharina, and Richard Masters, who later became the famous magician of the magical realm, it's safe to say that none of them were ever as associated with the vampire as Lindsay and Kirstine. Aside from battling his old enemies, he also made many new and powerful enemies during his life as a time traveller. Among these included Scavora, a demon who enjoyed transforming planets into the hideous hell world he had come from, out of resentment and jealousy. Fang imprisoned this demon within his own ship for many years, as there was seemingly no way to kill him. Unfortunately, however, during the collision with the living ship where Fang and Lindsay first met Kirstine, the demon escaped into space and would go on to infect and destroy more worlds, becoming one of Fang's most dangerous and evil enemies. However, perhaps his most dangerous foes were a race of demons known as the Yakelsa. These demons were relatives of vampires and vandals, though they were certainly not their allies. The Yakelza were the creations of Castran's bride during his first reign over the demons, the demon queen, Goraltia. While she may not have been a match for Castran physically, she was a match for him in terms of ambition and in some cases cruelty as well. Like all of Castran's concubines, however, she had no real power, but unlike the others, she actively plotted against him, which led to the future father of the vampires casting her out. Goraltia fled with Castran's son, Demenkos. Castran had many children, all of whom he disregarded. He certainly had no affection for Demenkos, but he did not like the idea of anyone else disposing of his children. Goraltia, meanwhile, murdered their son and cut his body into pieces in an attempt to try and harness any residual energy from Castran that may have been passed on to his child. Before she could do so, however, Castran tracked her down and vaporized Goraltia, though she had still managed to hide the mangled remains of her own son deep beneath the planet, Extana, which at that point was devoid of any intelligent life. In the ensuing centuries after Goraltia and Castran's own death, the people of Extama would emerge and progress into a highly advanced species technologically, but not socially. They would wage war with one another that proved to be so brutal it not only devastated the surface of their planet, but awoke and strengthened the dark demonic energy of Demenkos underneath, which soon burst its way through the ground. The energy took root into the body of a soldier dying from his wounds simply because it was the nearest body. The energy then formed its personality based on the soldier's hatred, bitterness, and resentment at what his life had become. That was all the energy which still had traces of Demenkos' mind could understand naturally. From there, the new demon that was born in the soldier not only took him over, but soon began to infect others, creating a new race of creatures called the Yakelza, made up of Demenkos' energy, the magics of Goraltia's experiments, and the horrors of the war itself. Yakelza means war in the Extana's language. What made the Yakelza so dangerous, however, was not simply their tremendous power, but the fact that they could transform anyone they killed through any means into a member of their kind, provided there was enough of the body left. Unlike vampires and vandals, and the majority of other demon species who had to directly infect natural creatures through their fangs, claws, and pincers, simply dying at these monsters' hands was enough, which allowed them to not only overrun Extama, but hundreds of other worlds throughout the cosmos. They also, having been created from one demon, had the ability to merge together into a single entity, though only 6 could do this at a time. They also had the power to absorb other demons into their bodies too, which Fang very nearly discovered the hard way when one of them tried to devour him. Among Fang's individual rivals, meanwhile, included Langica, a renegade witch from the Federation of Magic who enjoyed causing trouble on worlds throughout the galaxy with her spells, and the Gorgon's sister Elsteria, who had the power to rewrite the biology of any creature to be like hers, and believed it was her duty to save the universe by uniting all life forms by making them identical. Whilst Fang saved hundreds of worlds and galaxies from these monsters, he also endured many crushing defeats and losses at their hands, which weighed on his already tormented mind. Sadly, we don't know if Fang ever was able to find peace. There have been many accounts of his supposed final death, but given his ability to resurrect, no one can say for sure if any of them truly were the end. Wherever he is now, one thing for sure is that Professor Fang is the most important individual figure in the history of our universe. Were it not for him, history as we know it would not exist. The fact that this burden alone did not crush Fang is a testament to his strength, and why only he could have lived the life he has. Still, whilst we could admire Fang for his accomplishments, it's safe to say that even with all of the incredible things he has seen, no one would ever wish to trade places with him. He walks a fine line, not only between demon and man, but between order and chaos. One little mistake on just one of his travels, and it could all unravel in catastrophic ways. No matter how hard he tries to escape this crushing responsibility, it seems time itself will not allow him to rest. Fang is, in many ways, a prisoner of his life, rather than the free spirit and explorer some of his admirers would have you believe. I can only hope that some day he finds peace, whatever that may be for him.